The anime begins with our protagonist, Kyouya Shinomiya, who was part of a strange club that doesn't have any specific purpose, since all its members are free to do as they please and are led by the lowly president and beloved Mao. She tried to be independent, although there were times when her height worked against her and she couldn't even change a light bulb. So, the protagonist offers to do it, but she refuses because she believes she has to do it herself. Anyway, the protagonist helps her so she can do it, which makes her extremely nervous since he did it without warning and, in reality, she's afraid of heights, so it ends up being a disaster. After helping her properly, the protagonist starts reading manga and gets moved by a shoujo that just finished, so he recommends it to the president. But Megumi tells him that Mao can't read shoujo manga, since the kissing scenes make her very nervous, and that's why she only reads shonen and light novels. So, the protagonist shows her his collection of shonen manga, since he was also a fan of that type of manga. A little later, he passes by Shion and sees that she was playing chess. So, he asks her who she's playing with, and she tells him that it's a world champion to whom she owes a match for having won the world tournament. The protagonist is surprised to realize that she's so good, but then he sees that she has the rulebook, meaning she was actually a beginner, and it was all an act. It turns out that Shion comes from a family of geniuses, which is why it was believable that she was as good as a world champion, since her older brother is a renowned chef who always prepares her fancy meals. However, the next day she shows up with instant soup because her brother left for a competition. To make matters worse, Shion tries to eat the noodles while they're still hard, so the protagonist and Mao panic when they see what she's about to do and teach her how to properly eat this kind of noodles, although the protagonist can't believe how little she knows about the human world. After a while, Mao comes face to face with her worst nightmare: spiders. But the protagonist and Shion are also terrified of spiders, so there was no one willing to deal with the spider, even though it wasn't poisonous, since Karara was more concerned about her food than about the protagonist and the others. Luckily, Megumi arrives and gets rid of the spider from the club room as if it were nothing, so she looks really cool in the protagonist's eyes, which annoys Mao and she starts teasing her, so the protagonist tries to stop her, but only ends up slapping her and breaking Megumi's cup. Megumi doesn't think she's owed anything, but the protagonist insists that he wants to repay her somehow. Then, Megumi asks him to repeat her name 100 times, and the protagonist, like a fool, does it, although he ends up exhausted because he didn't expect it to be so embarrassing. Seeing this, the girls get nervous and ask the protagonist to do the same with them as well. When they're done, Karara goes to eat her meat, happy as can be, but the meat looks just like it does in video games and manga, so the protagonist and Mao want to know what it tastes like, although Shion warns them that it will be impossible to take meat away from someone as territorial as Karara. To everyone's surprise, she gives her meat to the protagonist, and Shion can only explain it by saying that she sees the protagonist as her superior, which makes sense since he is her senpai. But Mao gets jealous because she's the club president, and yet Karara still looks down on her. So she tries to take the meat from the protagonist, but Karara always snatches it away and gives it back to him. Because of this, Mao gets upset with the protagonist and tries to embarrass him a little, so she starts thinking of a nickname that's not as cool as their names. At first, she can only come up with food names, but Megumi thinks that Kyoro is a cute way to call him, so he ends up being nicknamed that. The next day, the protagonist sees that Shion is drinking canned coffee, which is very strange because another one of his brothers is a coffee expert, but Shion was curious about that kind of coffee. Even though he finds it odd, the protagonist tries it to see if it wasn't a prank, but now it's no longer just regular coffee, since drinking it would be an indirect kiss with the protagonist. After a few hours, Mao falls asleep and starts talking about her dream, which the protagonist finds very strange, but Shion comes up with a theory. He believes that Mao dreams about the things around her, and if she doesn't like them, it turns into a nightmare. To test this, he starts telling her a story in which the protagonist takes her food away like a real bully, so Mao begins to have a nightmare, confirming Shion's theory. When she wakes up, her hair ends up looking like a jungle. So, Megumi brushes her hair, and the protagonist just watches, which leads Megumi to ask him to do it himself, since he seems interested. The protagonist had never touched a woman's hair before, so he feels very embarrassed, but he does his best anyway and is surprised by what he finds inside Mao's hair. The next day, she starts reading a light novel, which surprises Megumi, since Shion usually doesn't do things that mortals do, but it's because the protagonist lent it to her, as he thought it was a good love story. Shion realizes they're talking about her, so Megumi runs away and leaves the apologies to the protagonist, although in reality, she just wanted to ask him some questions about the story. It turns out that Shion has never been in love, so she doesn't understand the feelings described in the novel, but Megumi interrupts them, since the atmosphere is starting to shift in a direction she doesn't like. To distract Shion, she challenges her to a game of Twister, because she's really confident in her skills at this game, but Mao thinks it's a dangerous game. Everyone ignores it because they don't see the danger, although later they realize what she meant, since you can end up in some really embarrassing positions, but Megumi doesn't care as long as she wins. Shion simply focuses on predicting the best move she can make to corner Megumi, but inevitably she would have to strike an embarrassing pose to win, so she decides to give up. The protagonist reassures her and gives her some tea for all the effort they've put into winning, although it's the first time he's ever made tea, so it tastes rather plain. The next game is suggested by Mao, since she wanted to practice arm wrestling, so she gathers all the girls to face off against the protagonist one-on-one. He is surprised to see how weak Mao is, but she's actually the weakest of them all, so he tells her not to get excited over something so small and sends her to Shion. It still wasn't enough, so Megumi and Mao join forces to try to defeat him. So, they have no choice but to unleash the beast, in other words, Kurara, and she sends the protagonist flying with her incredible strength. After a while, he wakes up and sees that Kurara is acting strange. Then, Mao tells him that the prize was rum raisin chocolates, which ended up getting her drunk, and that's why she's now going around kissing all the girls in the club, leaving only the protagonist out. He gets scared, since it looks like he's going to lose his first kiss to a wild beast, but Kurara sees things differently and prefers to just go to sleep. So the storm passes and those kinds of chocolates are banned to prevent future incidents. A few days later, the protagonist receives his club badge as he is finally accepted as an official member. He's surprised because he thought he already was a member, but Mao had forgotten. She forgot to hand in his registration form, which is why everything has only just been made official. Now he can use the communicator on his badge, but it turns out to be one of Mao's bad jokes, because all it does is play a kitten's voice. Later, Kyouya notices that Shion always wins at chess and is surprised because she's truly a genius, but Mao tells him not to call her a genius, since it bothers her. Shion says it's not exactly like that, but she does feel that people treat her differently because they think she's a genius. And so, the protagonist knows what it feels like to be left out, although Shion doesn't think it's to the same extent, since the protagonist is quite sociable. Because it's summer, the hours at the club are very long due to the heat, so Shion is glad to be someone with low body heat, since her hands always stay cold, which means she can cool off the protagonist. This is true bliss for the protagonist. But then, Shion realizes that if she keeps going like this, she'll get carried away, so she stops before losing control. Later, Megumi tells them that she heard all women are looking for a Prince Charming, and Shion agrees, since her brother has a theory that people desire what they learned as children, like stories about princes and other things. Although this lecture makes Mao jealous, since she thinks Shion was just showing off. Because of this, she later asks the protagonist if he feels confident enough to impress any woman, which leaves him confused. Then Mao gets more direct and starts complimenting him because she really likes his attitude, since he stays the same no matter how much she yells at him or hits him. To make matters worse, they start telling him that all the girls like the way he is. So the protagonist gets nervous and they start making him blush, which leads Mao to realize that deep down, he actually believes his attitude could charm any girl. After a while, Mao asks him the same question again, but this time the protagonist doesn't plan on falling for it so easily. Then Mao tells him that this time she's being serious, because ever since he arrived, the club's atmosphere has improved. The protagonist thinks it's not such a big deal, but Shion tells him he shouldn't be so bothered because in some countries it's not seen as a good trait, and to thank him, Megumi starts giving him a massage. The other girls join in with their own grateful caresses, so the protagonist starts to believe that his attitude really is quite charming in the club, falling right into Mao's game once again. Kyouya completely loses faith in women and resigns himself in a corner, so Mao apologizes, but the protagonist no longer trusts her. She keeps insisting and insisting until she starts crying because they won't forgive her, and so the protagonist apologizes for making her think he was upset, since even though he was in a bad mood, it wasn't anything personal. So Mao tries to calm down, but she still can't stop crying for several hours. The next day, we see how Kurara gets along very well with the cats, since she talks to them and had even adopted some. But just then, Mao arrives with an old television she found somewhere, which is a gem from the past because it's black and white. Shion repairs it so it can get a signal, but since it lacked an antenna, the main characters use their bodies to provide a signal. Amazingly, this works and they're able to watch a baseball game. Kurara gets excited and goes into fan mode because she's a fan of the Tigers, as she respects their strength, but because of this, they have to stay completely still for the 2 hours the game lasts. So it's not as fun as they thought it would be. A few days later, the club starts simulating weddings because they plan to offer this service at the school festival, since according to Shion, a lot of couples get together at big events. Although the protagonist wasn't sure if they'd get to marriage that quickly, Mao gets annoyed when she hears that he isn't very convinced about what they'll do for the festival, but they stop mid-bite because they hear the potato cart passing by, so they send Kurara to buy a bunch for everyone. It turns out she's a potato fanatic, but in the end, there's only one left and they decide everything with a game of rock, paper, scissors to see who gets the last potato. Shion is way too good at this game, so she beats everyone else without much trouble. After eating, everyone gathers to focus on their real mission at the festival, which is to make money, and for this they plan to sell lots of souvenirs like handmade sweaters. Shion adds that she discovered something that could be helpful, since she finds instant noodles made in pots to be amazing, although the protagonist and the others aren't surprised, since it was already a given that Shion wasn't the most knowledgeable about the mortal world. The next day, the protagonist is surprised to see Megumi in a maid outfit, and Shion explains that it's her costume from last year, but he feels really embarrassed being served by a maid. Then he wonders if Shion had also worn one of those outfits. She realizes what he's thinking and responds that she did indeed wear one, and even promises that she'll wear it again the next day. So the protagonist can't wait to enter the club room and see Shion in a maid outfit, but he's in for a big surprise because she's actually dressed as a butler, which was very popular among the girls last year. Mao, for her part, also wanted to wear the outfit she used before, so she puts on her hamster costume, and the protagonist doesn't know what to say to her because it's so random. But then, Mao wonders why they didn't have success with sales last year if costumes were cute, and the service consisted of making customers tell them they were cute. The protagonist plays dumb and wonders why, but Mao concludes they didn't research hamsters well enough. The protagonist doesn't understand how that's possible, since he was looking at one right then. Mao asks where, but when she realizes he's referring to her, she gets annoyed and doesn't hesitate for a second to bite the protagonist for being cheeky. The next day, a maid from Mao and Megumi's family comes to the club room to deliver a message to the latter, and the protagonist is surprised that they're so rich they have maids, but he can't help but ask her to do a little spin for him. The maid happily obliges, although the girls had been secretly watching the whole time to see what he would do, and now they've confirmed that he's a pervert trying to seduce their family's maid. After the festival, the club finally managed to rent out their wedding booth once, which was a surprise for the protagonist because it completely exceeded his expectations. But he also really enjoyed the dance she did, and he wasn't the only one. Karara still wants to dance, so she drags the protagonist onto the dance floor and tells him he smells like sweat from working so hard. The protagonist also thinks that she must have worked hard, and that's why she smells like sweat, but Karara takes this as an attempt at seduction. Then the other girls start to become suspicious of the protagonist's supposed kindness, since they interpret Karara's reaction as her defending herself from a sexual predator. A few days later, the protagonist is caught staring at Shion and she notices. She then asks him what exactly he was looking at. The protagonist tells her he was just curious because she looked disheveled, and Megumi noticed it too. So she grabs a comb to fix the problem, though she recommends the protagonist for his hairstyling skills, which have been 100% confirmed by Mao. Shion has no problem letting the protagonist comb her hair, so he does it, feeling very embarrassed. Then they sit down to have their tea as usual, but all of them feel that the protagonist could have a masculine voice if he wanted to, and since there's no reason not to, Mao asks him to do it. The protagonist agrees only because he doesn't want to say no, but he feels really weird speaking in such a deep voice, although the girls love it when he talks to them with his Johnny Walker voice. Then they ask him to call them by their names and act more daring, so the protagonist pretends to be a dominant man, which excites the girls because they didn't expect that side of him. Weeks go by and Christmas arrives, so Mao knits her stocking so Santa can pick up the presents, and the protagonist is surprised that she put so much effort into it since he knows Santa doesn't exist after all. But Megumi and Chio stop him, since Mao still believes in Santa and they don't want to ruin her childhood. Since they let her do as she pleased, Mao falls asleep after knitting for so long, so they ask the protagonist to carry her to the sofa, which makes him a bit nervous because out of context, they look like newlyweds. A few days later, the protagonist and Chio bury themselves in the kotatsu. Chio is surprised she has never enjoyed this marvel of engineering at home. Kyouya feels a bit of tenderness for her, as she has changed quite a lot and now shows weaknesses. Of course, this makes Chio defensive, but the protagonist teases her by keeping her supposed weaknesses a secret. After a while, the other girls arrive, so there isn't enough space for Megumi, who is the last to show up. So the protagonist offers to stand up, but Mao refuses to let anyone from the club go without the warmth of the kotatsu. She sits on the protagonist's lap, taking advantage of her light weight, though the protagonist feels uncomfortable with this solution. Valentine's Day arrives and Kyouya wonders if the girls did something special with a certain sweet, but Megumi tells him they did, having ordered a cake. The protagonist becomes obsessed when he sees it's not what he expected, so he drops hints, telling them it was a special day. This makes the girls realize it was Valentine's Day, and that the protagonist was expecting chocolates. Mao thinks it's none of their business, but the protagonist gets really depressed when he sees it'll be another year without chocolates. Then they reveal to him the agreement they made among the girls, since they all agreed not to give him any chocolates, although that doesn't mean they didn't make any. Just then, the maid Shinra arrives to give him her little chocolates, which brings the light right back to the protagonist's eyes, since she even gives him a free maid twirl. So he promises to return the gesture on White Day, but he refuses to give anything that might please the girls who didn't think of him, and on the contrary, actually agreed not to give him anything. Just so you know, folks, White Day is like Valentine's Day, but it's when the men have to give chocolates to the girls. A few days later, the protagonist skips club for the first time, so the girls feel really bored without him there, and Megumi starts to panic because now she has too much tea left over. But it's nothing serious to worry about, since he just went with his little sister to buy her a new cell phone. Everyone is surprised to find out he had a little sister, but it's not as strange as they think, since even Karara has a sister, who will be starting at the school next year. Mao is afraid of little sisters because she feels like at any moment they could surpass you, and she feels this way specifically because of her younger sister named Seira, who is almost as tall as her now due to the little sister incident. Mao calls the protagonist to come eat because she can't order the kids' menu without pretending to be a little girl, and as a little girl, she needs a guardian to be allowed into the restaurant. The protagonist wonders why she didn't pick someone else who could also do the job, but Mao gets flustered and tells him it's free food, so no, he'd better not ask and just enjoy it. Even after eating, Mao kept acting like the protagonist's Oni-chan, and then his real sister, named Kasumi, sees them. She goes into shock at the thought that the protagonist has another sister, but she breathes a sigh of relief when she finds out Mao was just pretending to be his little sister. Kasumi is surprised to learn that Mao is so old, since she obviously doesn't look it, but she's relieved because Mao can't compete with her as an Oni-chan. So she goes off to eat her sweets in peace. While the protagonist is waiting, he runs into a foreign girl who seems to be in trouble, so he doesn't hesitate to help her and wins this waifu's heart, since he seemed like the classic samurai who rescues anyone in need. That night, Kasumi stays in the protagonist's room reading his manga and admiring how cute Mao looked, since she seemed just like a little doll, from her hair to her figure. The protagonist admits that Mao has beautiful hair, and he knows this firsthand because he had styled it for her. This sets off Kasumi's jealousy alarms, since he has never styled her hair and she can't allow that, so she immediately asks him to do it. Since he has only done it a couple of times for girls at school, she orders him to style her hair every night to secure her position as his Oni-chan. A few weeks later, White Day arrives, so the protagonist goes to see Shinra to give her sweetest thanks for Valentine's Day. But the first one to greet him is Mao, who wanted a more casual relationship when they're outside her house. A little later, Shinra arrives and is happy to receive the gift, but Mao gets jealous because she didn't get anything, although the protagonist doesn't feel he has to since she didn't give him anything for Valentine's Day. Then Megumi arrives, so they sit down to have tea while looking at the family photo album, which makes her feel touched seeing little Mao, even though she hasn't changed much. Although the one who wins the prize for being the most well-preserved is Shinra, since she literally hasn't changed at all. She says that it's not even her since her mother replaces her from time to time, and because they look exactly the same, no one notices. Seira sees that they were having tea, so she joins the party, but then the protagonist starts hearing some rather unfriendly voices, which Mao also hears. It turns out that Seira had the gift of being a ventriloquist, meaning she could talk without moving her mouth, and for some reason, Megumi can't hear this voice, so she can badmouth as much as she wants without her favorite sister seeing her true thoughts. When he gets home, the protagonist realizes that many of his manga have disappeared, and this is Kasumi's doing, since she found them obscene and confiscated them. Although, as consolation, he still has the ones where the sister is the protagonist, since those seem appropriate to her. A few days later, a new member named Tamaki joins the club, and she likes taking photos. She takes a picture of the protagonist while he's sleeping, which the others think is great, especially because she's very skilled at hiding the camera and can take pictures anywhere without the teachers stopping her. Tea time arrives, and Tamaki gets upset because there isn't any cake, since when they kidnapped her to join the club, they promised her cake every day, and now she doesn't see any. So Megumi tries to calm her down because it's hard to make cake every day, but Tamaki doesn't understand words. Because of this, Mao decides to unleash the club's ultimate persuasion weapon, which is the protagonist in macho mode. So he switches to a dominant attitude and speaks directly to Tamaki, making her nervous and causing her to give in a little out of pity for Megumi, who gets up at 2 in the morning every time she has to make a cake. Because of this, Tamaki satisfies her hunger with other foods, which increases the protagonist's food expenses. Stop fooling around. The protagonist and Shion meet at the club. Mao tries to persuade her by pointing out the insane amount of fat she eats daily, warning she could gain weight. Even Shion points out fat is worse than regular calories, but only Megumi gets hurt, as she gains weight easily, unlike Tamaki, who doesn't gain weight no matter how much she eats. The next day, Mao stands on top of the protagonist, and Shion gets scared seeing them, thinking it's perverted, but they're just giving massages, taking advantage of Mao's featherweight. Shion feels like getting on, but the protagonist asks her not to because it would be too much. However, Megumi doesn't hear this and gets on anyway because she thinks it's fun, questioning why why the protagonist would suffer from excess weight, which ends up making Megumi even more depressed, as it brings back her insecurity about being overweight. Kurara also has the misfortunes of dieting because her little sister got upset when she saw Kurara was eating meat. She sent her a kilo of vegetables, but Kurara hates them. So she dumps them on the protagonist, who was the first to ask about these vegetables. Then everyone gathers for tea and Mao orders the protagonist to brush Megumi's hair, because she had asked him a while ago and wanted him to experience firsthand what he made her and Shion feel. The protagonist worries because it seems like he's doing a terrible job, but the real reason is something else. It's meant as a punishment. So Kyouya does what he always does and Megumi starts blushing, since she feels ticklish when the protagonist brushes her hair, so you could say Megumi is no longer pure because she succumbed to the protagonist's brush skills. Weeks go by and it starts getting hot, but even so Mao gets into the kotatsu to say goodbye to it, since it's about time to put it away. Shion gets sad, since she wanted to use it more because she couldn't while it was cold, and the protagonist comes up with lots of things they could do with it, ideas that fit with what the club usually does for challenges or punishments. But Mao thinks they should put it away anyway, since the former president taught her that everything has a beginning and an end. Tamaki is surprised that there was another president, since based on Mao's appearance it seems like she's always been the president and has never grown or anything. Then Mao gets angry because they basically called her a loli and she jumps to attack. Tamaki is very similar to Mao, so the two fight hand to hand, but they're not just similar in personality, they're also the same size. So they have to figure out how to fit everyone in when they all want to be under the kotatsu. Shion doesn't miss the chance and puts her on her lap as if she were the little sister she's always wanted. So Tamaki has no choice but to put up with Shion's affection as if she really were her little sister. A few days later, the protagonist tells them that his little sister won't stop asking about Machan, and Mao wonders who that is. So the protagonist tells her that it's actually her, it's just that Kasumi gave her a nickname. Mao gets really upset because she doesn't like being called a nickname like Machan, and she also didn't want the others to find out that she pretends to be a little girl to go to the restaurant. Because of this, Mao ends up revealing to everyone what she had done, so everyone is surprised that she wants to be a little sister. As if the embarrassment wasn't enough, the protagonist tells her that Kasumi will be stopping by the club, but this is Mao's fault, since she saw the bite marks and couldn't think of anything to say. So Kasumi wanted to come by to see Machan. Mao can't believe he didn't tell her this sooner, but either way she runs off to transform since she didn't want her secret to be discovered. Kasumi finds out that Machan comes almost every day and wonders why. Then the protagonist tells her it's to do homework and to pass off middle school homework as elementary school homework, saying it's from a private school. Kasumi is surprised by how difficult it is because she doesn't know if she'd be able to do it. So she decides to give it a try, and after a while she manages to solve one of the exercises, earning everyone's praise since not even Mao, who's in her second year, was able to do it. Mao gets annoyed when she hears the protagonist say that and doesn't hesitate for a second to move him. So Kasumi goes along with it because she's been wanting to learn for a while, so Mao gives her the real tips, and Kasumi ends up causing her the same pain that Mao inflicts with her bites full of anger. In the following days, the heat hits the club hard, but Mao doesn't want to turn on the fan to save on the electricity bill, and she tries to calm everyone down by saying that enduring the heat is a club activity. However, after a while she gets tired of the heat and asks the protagonist to fan her, promising that she'll give him a breeze in return later. After several minutes, Kyouya realizes that Mao has no intention of keeping her promise, but she tells him not to be discouraged, since she'll make it up to him later with a day at the pool. Because of this, the next day, the girls put on their swimsuits at the club, and the protagonist can't wait to get into the pool to cool off from the heat, but Mao tells him to wait because Kasumi was also invited along with several of her friends. It turns out that Kasumi is friends with Kurara's little sister, named Geraldine, or Ger, as they call her. She is surprised to see the protagonist because she has admired him like a samurai ever since he helped her at the train station, and she hasn't stopped speaking highly of him to Kurara in their classroom. The next to arrive is Shinra, since Sera is also friends with Kasumi and is surprised to see her older sisters here, but Mao quickly hushes her because she's so smart that she must have already figured out what's going on with Mao's appearance. So she asks her to play along. Now the mini-girls need to change, so Mao kicks the protagonist out so they can do it, and then they spend their time playing with water guns. But then Kyouya gets mesmerized when he sees Shinra in a swimsuit, and she gives him a little twirl in her maid swimsuit, which makes him drool. Then Mao gets annoyed and kicks him out. After that, the girls change into yukatas because it's common to go to festivals after a day at the pool, and Shinra gives him another little maid twirl, this time in a yukata, but Mao sends him flying again for free. And to top it off, the other waifus also scold him for his maid fetishes. A few days later, the protagonist starts asking Mao some questions because she wanted him to play doctor and solve her problems, although she wasn't very willing to cooperate with the questions he was asking. So, the consultation loses much of its meaning, since since the protagonist isn't a doctor, and Mao notices that he gets upset, so she thinks he gets angry every time she bothers him. But he reassures her, telling her that's not the case, because most of the things she does he sees as her games, and that's why they don't make him angry. The next patient is Shion, who is supposedly in a terrible depression because of her personality, but the protagonist knows that all she really needs is a little sister, so he calls Tamaki as his assistant and has her act as a little sister so that Shion can be freed from all her troubles. Then Megumi comes in for her consultation, and the protagonist starts with his usual question about what's bothering her. Megumi had never felt angry, except for the time she heard that Tamaki never gained weight no matter how much she ate. That time, she did seem angry, and nothing guarantees she isn't still angry, which terrifies Tamaki. Finally, the protagonist sees Kirara, although she was in perfect health. In fact, she was doing almost too well since her superhuman strength far exceeds that of a normal. After finishing with the girls, they tell the protagonist that it's now his turn, and to keep him from escaping, they tie him up. Since his therapy will be very special, they're going to put makeup on him to make him look cute. The girls are surprised at how good he looks, to the point that they even think they've created a beauty monster. But Mao didn't want to stop there, saying there were still possible improvements. So they put a wig on him, and just like that, the protagonist could easily pass as another waifu. The next day, Shinra approaches the club at the request of her mistresses because she had been told about a little competition they were going to have, and the opponent was the protagonist, who is undefeated. Kyouya doesn't understand what they're talking about, but he definitely doesn't want to face Shinra. So they explain to them that all he had to do was style her hair, since Shinra is the ultimate woman. The protagonist still doesn't understand, but he goes along with it and styles Shinra's hair as they ask, which makes her start blushing from the pleasure of being groomed by the protagonist. This surprises the girls, since a woman like Shinra doesn't fall so easily. But the protagonist is something else, since he had learned how to give massages, and this surpasses Shinra's resistance, making him the winner. And the girls are surprised that not even the final boss Shinra can handle the protagonist. Hours later, Kirara is left staring at the ceiling, so the protagonist and Mao wonder what's going on. Then Shion explains her theory to them. It turns out that Kirara has feline instincts, which allow her to see things they can't, so the protagonist and Mao start to panic because they think there are ghosts in the club, and to make matters worse, things start falling over out of nowhere, which makes them even more certain that they need to do something. Tamaki listens to the protagonist's concerns, so she decides to get to work, since she used to be a priestess at her family's temple and knows how to perform exorcisms. However, for this they'll need an offering too, so the girls offer up the protagonist, and Tamaki begins to drive away the spirit. Kirara realizes that what she was watching has disappeared, but when she sees that they're offering up the protagonist as a sacrifice, she joins the fun and takes it up a notch, since she wants to cook him to make it a proper offering. The next day, Mao notices the protagonist drawing, and is surprised the dragon he drew turned out really well. It had many features on its stomach, but when she sees the determined look on his face, she realizes the dragon represents her, so she bites him for calling her a monster. He tries to tell her that he didn't mean for her to mistake his drawing for a dragon, since he was actually trying to draw her. Then Shion tries to calm them down, saying that, after all, they were just drawings and it wasn't the only thing he had made, so they should just look at the rest of them. The next one was Shion, but they mistake her for a prawn. However, when they read that she's intelligent, has a lot of personality issues, is obsessed with her sister, and addicted to the kotatsu, Shion realizes it's supposed to be her. So she also gives the protagonist a little bite for drawing her so badly. This time, Megumi tries to calm them down, saying it's not a big deal, but then she also realizes that the supposed fairy they see in the drawing was her. This surprises the girls, since their self-perception is basically non-existent, so they don't realize when someone is talking about them until one of their flaws is pointed out, one they do recognize in themselves. Megumi is another of cases, because when she highlights sadness about weighing 50 kilos, they realize they're talking about her. She jumps to bite the protagonist, although she's harmless that her bite is affectionate. While the protagonist wonders how things got so out of hand, Kirara looks at the notebook and notices that he drew a cute little cat, which she really likes. So the protagonist plays along and tells her it's just a big cat he knows. But inevitably she realizes he's talking about her, so she jumps on the protagonist because she doesn't like being lied to, although she actually does put the protagonist's life in danger, since it looks like she's really going to eat him. The next day, Kyouya brings Shion a McDonald's hamburger since she had always wanted to try them, and after eating it, she wants to have it again another day. But this wasn't such a good idea, because if she eats too much, she'll gain weight. Megumi hears her least favorite word, so she switches to her evil mode and proposes a challenge to the supposedly never-gains-weight girl, Tamaki. She will bake her a large cake every day of the week to make her gain weight. Tamaki doesn't really understand what the purpose of the challenge is, but she accepts because she'll get to eat a lot of cake. So, at the end of the week, she weighs herself, and Megumi can't believe her eyes, because the exact opposite of what they expected has happened. Tamaki actually lost weight. A few weeks later, October arrives, so Kasumi and Jerry go to the club to ask for candy. So the protagonist gives Tamaki's chips to her because she had eaten too much, but Jerry wanted the protagonist to act cool, like she remembers. The girls start putting pressure on him because they can't keep ignoring her request. Then Kyouya switches to his cool mode, which captivates Jerry, since she thinks he's the coolest Japanese guy in the world, although Sarah is disgusted to see that he left her sisters and switched his attention to someone younger. But this aggressive side is really just a tsundere mode, because when the protagonist talks to her directly, she also gets embarrassed and turns submissive. The next day, the cold returns, so she buries herself in the kotatsu to eat mandarins. But the protagonist notices that Mao removes the white parts and thinks she would enjoy it more if she ate quickly. But it turns out she hates those white parts on the fruit, so she gets annoyed when he tries to give her unpeeled mandarins and ends up biting him for being a nuisance. Then she shows the protagonist and Takami the catgirl outfit she bought on her way to school, since she thinks it would look good on Takami. She tries to run away, since there's no way she'd ever wear that, but the protagonist tells her she might as well give up, because Mao won't stop until she gets her to put it on, and to top it off, it would actually look cute on her. Takami blushes when she hears this last part from the protagonist, even though someone else had already said it before. It turns out that Shion had been listening and put it on while the other two were arguing, but when she sees that everyone goes quiet, she thinks it doesn't look good on her. Then the protagonist tells her that's not it, because it actually looks great on her. It's just that no one ever expected her to wear something like that. Now, continuing with the costume party, all the girls dress up in men's clothes and even change their names, and after letting the protagonist admire their traba side, they catch him because their real intention was to have an excuse to dress him up as a girl again. The next day, Karara starts coughing because of the cold. So, Shion checks her and gets the impression that she doesn't have the flu. Then, she recommends that she rest until her sister arrives, but they didn't expect Jerry to arrive in record time after hearing that her sister was sick. Because of this, the protagonist catches it too and starts coughing the next day. But in his case, he does get a bit of a fever, so Kasumi and the other girls come to check on him, worried, except for Sarah, who actually just wanted to clean him up to prevent him from infecting her beloved sisters. But the more disinfectant spray she uses, the more they all start coughing, so she ends up filling the room with gas, thinking it's the virus that's making her sisters sick. A few weeks later, Valentine's Day was just 2 weeks away, so Mao asks the protagonist if he's curious about last year's agreement not to give him chocolates. And no matter how much he tries to deny his curiosity, Shion realizes he wants to know. So she explains that it wasn't anything special. Mao just thought he might get too excited if they gave him chocolates. So they agreed not to do it so he wouldn't get too full of himself. The protagonist thinks it's ridiculous because he would never get carried away like that. But Mao tells him that's all in the past, since this year they agreed to skip that arrangement, and that's why Megumi was preparing something big to make up for it. Although Mao was too lazy to spend money on the protagonist, so she plans to give him chocolate candies. Anyway, the protagonist eagerly awaits Valentine's Day and receives some chocolates that are delicious and some that aren't so great. But Shinra also shows up to give him chocolates again, although she's also there on another errand, since Sarah found out that she lost to the protagonist and she doesn't accept losers in the family, so she wants a rematch, because last time she beat Shinra's mother. The protagonist realizes that if he wins, Shinra will be fired, so without a second thought, he surrenders because it's just too much, and Sarah accepts this outcome. However, Shinra calls him a coward, and the protagonist is left speechless, since he never really understood those supposed duels. A few weeks later, the day of Mao, Shion, and Karara's graduation arrives. So, the protagonist arrives super early at the clubroom to spend as much time as possible with the girls, and he wasn't the only one, because the girls thought the same thing. The protagonist wonders if they're going to do something special for the last day, but Mao tells him no, because it's just a normal day at the club. So Shion takes him to the vending machine to show him her progress, since before he arrived, her common sense was actually pretty low, and she couldn't even use those kinds of machines, drink canned coffee, or do other similar things. And that's why she thanks him for all the time he spent with them, since he's been something like their knight of common sense. Then, the girls leave the room and leave Karara alone with the protagonist, but she has no idea what to do. So she asks him to talk by message, since that's where she can communicate more easily. The protagonist tells her that he doesn't have anything planned either, so Karara thinks that maybe he's getting bored being with her. The protagonist tells her that obviously he's not. Then she gets happy since she never gets bored being with him because he's always changing his scent, and that's why she wants him to brush her hair on this last day, so she won't be the only one the protagonist hasn't styled. The protagonist gladly does it and thinks that now that Shion and Karara have already said their goodbyes, it's Mao's turn, but she doesn't say anything to him until the graduation is over. Then Megumi tells him not to worry, since Mao was just too embarrassed to talk to him at that moment. The protagonist knows that's just Mao's personality, so he doesn't take it the wrong way and congratulates everyone as if nothing happened. They even prepare diplomas for them and congratulate each one individually because they are unique and need to keep improving even outside the club. Mao passes the mantle of president to the protagonist, since she now understands the spirit of the club. In fact, she had wanted to do it several months ago, but the protagonist wasn't ready yet, so she waited until this moment arrived. So Tamaki wonders what spirit they're talking about, but neither Mao nor the protagonist protagonist tells her, since it's something they have to discover for themselves. And in this way, the girls graduate and leave the club in the reliable hands of the protagonist. Now we start with the first OVA. A few days later, Kyo experiences deja vu as he gets kidnapped again to be brought into the club, even though the waifus have already graduated. The protagonist realizes that the place is a bit different, especially on the outside, since they were literally in another city. It turns out the club had organized a graduation trip, and Shinra took care of recreating the club in New York so they could do their club activities on the other side of the world. These activities basically consisted of everyone goofing off in their own way, so nothing really changes, even if they're doing it on the other side of the world. But one thing they could actually enjoy was the famous American hamburgers. Although the girls felt a bit cheated because supposedly food in the West was supposed to be really fast, but it took way too long. This was because they sent the mini waifus to buy them, and they got distracted sightseeing. But luckily, Shinra wasn't about to let his mistresses starve, so he showed up right away with homemade burgers. The protagonist wonders if they're still American hamburgers since Shinra made them, but Mao tells him that it doesn't matter who makes them. What matters is where they're made. So finally, Shion can satisfy her craving for burgers, which was already driving her crazy. Then the girls want dessert, but they don't want to buy any, so they decide to celebrate Halloween since Mao believes this holiday was born in New York, and it doesn't matter that it's not even close to October. The other girls get excited and start asking for candy. Because of this, the protagonist has no choice but to dress up, and once again, as usual, they dress him up as a girl, which never fails to surprise the girls because it suits him ridiculously well. Thanks to this, their candy collection is a complete success, doing a job worthy of the new club president. Weeks later, the protagonist runs into Mao while he's out buying tea, but she doesn't say a word to him, and the other girls chase after him because they want to bring the two of them together. So they send them messages to get them to go to the same place, but even then, Mao still doesn't speak to the protagonist. On the contrary, she gets upset with Shion, who doesn't show up even though she told her to wait at the station, and because of this, she listens to the messages Shion sends her from afar. Then he starts to suspect that they were being followed, but thanks to Karara, they manage to hide among the trees, and Mao starts complaining to the protagonist. Realizing that she was talking to him as usual, she stops. Then the protagonist asks her why she didn't want to talk to him, but before she can answer, Tamaki appears. So Mao leaves alone and tells him that he'll never see her again. Kirara takes Tamaki away so she won't interrupt again, and they decide to get more involved than they had planned in order to draw Mao in. So they ask the protagonist to go to the park, where he meets Mao again. But this time, they don't let her get away and take her to the school to spend the night. Kyo is already worried because they don't have permission to be there, and Shion thinks it would be dangerous if they were discovered, since they could even shut down the club for breaking the rules. But this isn't something the former president would care about, because according to the club's philosophy, it's more fun to do things without worrying about the rules, or at least that's how Mao used to think. She tells her that her way of thinking doesn't make sense anymore, since she's no longer part of the club anyway. But just then, a security guard comes by to check, so Karara warns them and they all go quiet. Mao breaks down because she doesn't want the club to be shut down because of her, since she knows everyone is there because of her. But then the protagonist tells her that even if they were caught, the club would never close because it lives in their hearts, and no matter what happens, they will always be part of the club. Mao pauses to reflect for a moment and realizes he's right. Then she goes back to her usual self, biting the protagonist as always, which makes everyone happy because Mao had been down ever since she left the club. The protagonist invites her to come whenever she wants, since they will always welcome her with open arms. But Mao tells him that she won't come back, even though she's cheered up, because the club needs to be reborn with new members, just as it always has. Anyway, since they're already here, Mao doesn't see why they can't have fun tonight. Although the protagonist refuses to never see her again, he then tells her that, just as she said, the bonds between them are eternal, and that's why they can see each other anytime, even if it's not at the club. Mao agrees with the protagonist, and the other girls also join in this agreement to never be apart, so they start that night having fun as always, regardless of the fact that they are no longer official members of the school's GJ Club. And that's it, folks. That's how everything that's been animated of the GJ Club anime comes to an end. As always, I'll try to leave you two similar anime recommendations on the end screens. Bye.